Oh, yes, probably is. Yes, yes. Yeah, that would be good. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Margaret,
Yeah.
how shall I name it?
How should you name it?
Yeah. For the stream, evening Advent talk?
Yeah. Okay. I want to put this on the floor. Yeah. Doesn't look very good.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, if you just lean back, I think, and talk outwards. Why don't I give that to you? I don't really want it, but I should be waving books around, so you might want to wave that one.
Well, in which case I might want to wave also the...
That one. I want
Yes,
to.
yes.
Yeah, we're live in 1 minute. No, I want to wave that one too. So I'll
Yes,
bring this
okay.
one over here. Yep.
Yeah, you can start.
I'm also quoting from. So, welcome to St Paul's for this Advent talk as one of a series in Faith and Ferment, Theologians in Context. And this is the final talk in the series. We started it off last Lent, and it's now we're now coming to an end. And finally, we're getting up to date. So the key point really about Don Cupitt is that he's still alive. Could we have the first slide, please? We know that in each generation, Christianity is reinterpreted. There were particular periods of ferment. For example, in the first few hundred years after the life of Jesus, and also, of course, in the Reformation, in Victorian times where people were coming to try and come to terms with Darwinism, with the fact that there were lots of other gospels around that weren't included in the Bible. And finally also with the way that culture moves on and people think. So it seemed important to us that we should take somebody who was active in the last period, right, and is still alive. The second point is that he has an interesting trajectory of beliefs. We actually have the person who's written his biography, which is a man called Nigel Leaves, an Australian, has identified 7 different periods during which his beliefs changed. Now, there's no way I'm going to take you into 7 periods of 7 different trends within it, but nevertheless, it has changed his beliefs, and it's interesting to see how these developed. Often, when he got into a new reading about a new philosophical tradition. Thirdly, his views are challenging. I believe very strongly that we only learn if we engage with what other people are saying. It's not enough to just stay within our own little shells. So it seemed important to take somebody who was going to make us think. We may not agree with him, we probably won't agree with him on many or even everything, but certainly it's worth considering what he has to say because it helps us to sharpen our own views. But why Cupitt in particular? Well, actually there's not much choice. I was just going to quote from, this is written in 2004. I won't tell you who it is till the end, but he says, he's talking about Honest to God, which was published in the 1960s, and it's part of a conference which took place 40 years after that. And the quotation is, if the Christian faith was to remain credible, and if it was to survive, It had to engage with issues like the nature of God and the incarnation in a manner that would be intelligible to the social and intellectual revolution of the 1960s. The challenge for Christians today is to continue to engage with these radical issues in our context. So that's, first of all, somebody trying to say that we have to engage with what's happening today, and that's actually our own parishioner, Bishop Richard Cheetham, who is asking us to engage with the most recent trends. But finally, we also have the possibility of looking at others. And I'm also going to quote now from a book called Sceptical Christianity by Robert Rees, who is a canon of Westminster Abbey. And he says, "I've come to think that the Church of England is not currently engaged as deeply as it might be with contemporary scepticism. Since David Jenkins was Bishop of Durham, if I look for examples of episcopal engagement with matters such as the nature of God or what happens to us after death, the stable looks pretty bare." So here we have a modern somebody who's high up in the Anglican Church saying that there's not a lot around. We did have a choice between Rowan Williams and Don Cupitt, and I thought you might like to just know that Rowan Williams actually early on wrote a paper called "On Not Quite Agreeing with Don Cupitt." I think actually the gap would be a bit larger now than it was in the 1980s. But in 2004, Cupitt wrote, "Don't tell his evangelical tormentors, but there are passages in Rowan Williams that sound surprisingly like me." So there are some overlaps, and Hugh's going to say a little bit more about the contrast between Rowan Williams and Don Cupitt. Right, well, who was Don Cupitt? What did he do? First of all, what was his, what did he do during his lifetime? Could we have the next slide, please? He was born in Oldham in Lancashire in 1934 to a mother who was a machinist in a factory and a father who was an engineer who actually came from Derby but was in Oldham because he was laying gas pipes. And they met, and for the first 5 years, Don Cupitt was brought up in Oldham, and he was the eldest of 4 children. His father did well. He had a good war, as you might say, because he then, after working as a sort of minor engineer, he then followed evening school for education. He became a manager of a factory, and during the war he was finally managing 3 or 4 factories, all producing parts for aircraft. So this meant the family travelled around the country, and the family were able to educate their children in boarding schools, in independent boarding schools. So Don went to Charterhouse, and there he became interested in Christianity. His family had no connections with the church at all, so he had no background, but he became interested when he, as a result of discussions with his teachers at Charterhouse. However, he was even more interested in Darwinism, so he followed that up by going to Cambridge to do natural sciences. In his first year in Cambridge, he was sucked into an evangelical movement and then decided it wasn't quite for him. So after the first year, he moved to a liberal group, which I think was the Student Christian movement at the time, and found his sort of place much better in that. Cambridge in the 1950s was a fairly radical place. There's a book, for example, called Soundings, which has a number of quite radical papers by people who were around in Cambridge at the time. That was published in 1962, and Honest to God, I think, was 1963. So these were all happening around that. So Don Cupitt became very excited by all these things that were happening in Cambridge, and therefore switched after 2 years from doing natural sciences to do theology. So he did his final year of theology. and then decided he was going to be ordained, but in between he had 2 years of national service, which meant that he was sitting around in the sunshine in Cyprus, and he was able to read lots of theological books. So then he came back to Cambridge, trained at Westcott House, which was a liberal theological college, and there Hugh and I must have listened to one of his lectures. One of our friends swears that we were in attendance at his lecture, but I have to say that neither of us actually remember, so that's a sort of personal view. But we were about in Cambridge in the 60s, so we do have a kind of link with the maelstrom that was going on there with Don Cupitt as well. From Cambridge he was ordained and chose to go to a curacy in Salford, in his native Lancashire, but in a big city outside, very poor area of Salford outside Manchester. And this brought him up sharply with the contrast from Cambridge, because he found that very few people were attending church there. Most of them were getting on with their lives quite happily without any need for Christianity. And he found he had to try and explain doctrines of the church to people who weren't really very interested. So this was a big challenge to his views, and for to try and come to terms with what people actually were talking about and thinking about in the streets of Salford. He was then headhunted to return to Cambridge to lecture himself at Westcott House as vice principal, and he then had to do teaching lots of different modules, so had to learn lots more, broaden his theological base. He arrived back then in 1962, and he's actually stayed ever since. He's now retired, but he still lives in Cambridge. From Westcott House, he needed a bit more money when he got married and started to have children, so he became Dean of Emmanuel College and had a lectureship in the Department of Divinity at Cambridge, and continues very much there now. So he's been in Cambridge then for something like 60 years, and you might say, well, what's happened during that time? First of all, he's produced 40 books. This is obviously a terrible mistake to try and give a lecture about somebody who'd produced 40 books, because I'm afraid we haven't read them all, but we have read about 5 or 6 of them, and I'll show you what they are in a minute. In between producing the books, he also was involved with 3 television series, one of which became very well known as The Sea of Faith. That's a quotation from Matthew Arnold poem. I haven't got time to read it all, but basically the poem is about the Christianity ebbing away like the tide ebbs away on an empty beach. And the Sea of Faith became a movement and was very strong, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, also in Britain, and took a lot of his time. He became very exhausted by the continual writing, by television and so on, all the media, and also by the fact that by now people within the church, we're now talking about the 1980s, were actually demanding that he resign from his the fact that he was ordained as a vicar. And so he was subject to a lot of criticism in the church, and as a result of all these things had a bit of a nervous breakdown really in the mid-90s, and was completely exhausted for a while. After that, it should be said that actually he's never been turned out of the Church of England. He decided in the early 2000s that he should resign from his permission to officiate. But he remains within the Church of England in good standing as a priest, so he is still there. He says he owes this to the then Archbishop of Canterbury, who was Robert Runcie, who was mentioned last week, who was actually an ex-supervisor of his at Cambridge. And Robert Runcie really argued for him to stay within the church. In about sort of bit more than 10 years ago, he actually did stop attending regularly Anglican communion. So he has moved in that direction, but he is still technically an ordained minister of the church. That tells us about what he has done. It doesn't tell you very much about what he believes. So could we have the next slide, please? This is in his own words. He says, "I am someone who likes modern Western philosophy, who retains a strong devotion to Jesus Christ, who has an affinity with much in the Jewish and Buddhist traditions, and who has been trying to build up a body of free and experimental religious writing." That was in 1999. In 2017, not long ago, he says, "I seem to have moved from standard Western Christian faith to an eclectic Christian philosophy of life." And I think that sort of explains his journey, really, over those years of where he's been. To fill in some of the details now, just to mention, first of all, the books. Can we have the next slide, please? The key books. The first one actually wasn't a book of his, but it is a book that he was asked to contribute to, and it's called The Myth of God Incarnate. I have to say this man has a talent for deeply provocative titles. Probably he wouldn't have caused nearly so much stir if he hadn't entered into things that were, almost guaranteed to upset people in the Anglican Church. But it's quite important that he contributed to this book. He was quite young at the time, and he had been approached to apply for a post that would have taken him to the highest levels in the church. At the same time, he was asked to contribute to this book, and he chose to contribute to the book, but to remain in Cambridge as an academic rather than moving into the church hierarchy. So that's quite significant for his development, I think, and shows the first time when he moved across into a more radical spirit. The other books on the list, let me just go through them. Taking Leave of God was a very important one, another horribly provocative title. It is actually a quotation from Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic, so it's not actually his words. But that moved on from there, it moved on fairly rapidly to The Sea of Faith. The Sea of Faith is an account of what came in the television series that was, I do remember watching, and which was very influential, probably the most influential thing he ever did. Jesus and Philosophy I'm going to mention because it's very recent, well, not that recent, 2008, but it is actually quite an interesting discussion of his view on the nature of Jesus. And it doesn't occur in many of the other books, so I think it's quite an important one. I found it very interesting, very readable. And finally, the most influential of his most recent books is probably Above Us Only Sky. I felt a bit concerned because we've just been singing a carol about being up in the sky, but this again, another provocative title, is more about his views about ethics and how to live a Christian life. So they're the books. Now, what were the themes? Could we go on to the next slide, please? The one main theme that came quite early is probably the one that he's probably most renowned for, is that he calls himself a radical Christian non-realist, sometimes a Christian humanist, and he claims to reject the supernatural in Christianity. So one of his favourite sayings is that all this is all there is. I'm now going to move on to Hugh, who's going to talk a bit about, because this is one of the kind of key themes, Hugh's going to say a bit more about this.
Well then, from Margaret's account, we have this unorthodox and influential religious thinker, Don Cupitt. Cupitt believes that the world we experience is all that there is. He does not believe that there is a God up there or out there who can intervene in our day-to-day affairs, a God that is literally supernatural. This is what I will call the rejectionist view of the supernatural.
Could we have the next slide? Sorry, we're on the right slide. Yeah, fine, thank you.
Yeah. I want to set this view in the context of two other views. One accepts biblical accounts of the supernatural, the traditionalist view, and the second seeks to reinterpret such accounts, the revisionist view. To investigate, I would call in aid the conference to which Margaret has referred. As she said, it occurred close to home in this diocese in 2003. It was chaired by Richard Cheetham, Bishop of this parish, Bishop Cheetham. It was called to reflect on the work of John Robinson, that Christian skeptic of the previous generation. It was attended by Don Cupitt, and its proceedings were published accessibly in an SCM paperback. So first, I will start from Cupitt. In his contribution, Cupitt criticized Robinson for being ambiguous between a realist and a non-realist view of God. What a realist believes is that God really does exist independently of human thoughts, wishes, imagination, and emotions. What a non-realist believes is that God is simply the object of such human thoughts, wishes, imagination, and emotions. In other words, a subjective creation. Cupitt is, of course, in the latter category. And he insists that others must be squarely in one patch or the other. This sharp division between the two, the objective world given to us empirically, and the subjective world of our own thoughts and imaginations, is part of the postmodern philosophic outlook, an outlook which was important at the time and still is. As Cheetham put it at the seminar in a regretful fashion, we are surrounded by the contours of postmodernism. Now, Cupitt develops his postmodern attitude in his book, Above Us Only Sky, Margaret has mentioned. In it, he claims that everything is immanent, interconnected, and secondary. There is no separate realm to be inhabited by an objective God. However, within this one world, Cupitt finds a special place for life, and in particular, one's own life. Since there is nothing else, we should treat all life as a sacred gift and responsibility, he reasons. Life, he claims, is God, or as he subsequently puts it more carefully, life is now as God to us. This is the humanism strand, I suppose. The Christian duty of care for souls should be replaced by a duty that lives should be lived in an authentic, worthwhile, and ethically good fashion. So that's Cupitt's version of my second category, the rejectionist view, a rejection of the supernatural in favor of life being as God to us. Thus, the conference had before it the radical rejectionism of Cupitt, and I should add, the less radical rejectionism of John Robinson. To this, the Bishop of Woolwich in 2003, Colin Buchan, duly responded with a clear statement of a traditionalist view. In his presentation to the conference, Buchan noted that our traditional creed says that, for our sake and for our salvation, Jesus came down from heaven and that he ascended into heaven. Buchan, for his part, believes in this description of Jesus physically ascending, yes, going up into the clouds at his ascension. This is not to locate Jesus as physically up there. As Buchan conceives it, a subsequent transition occurred out of sight of us, but it is to claim that the concept of upness is integral to the concept of Godheadness, and that Jesus' physical ascension is an essential part of the picture. So that's my second category of traditionalism. Now for revisionism. And perhaps surprisingly to some, I propose to call as my witness the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and his book, Christ, the Heart of Creation. That's that book. At the outset, Williams offers his concept of God as being, in his words, an infinite agent. This in the sense that God creates the conditions for agency in general and for all us finite agents in particular. In this, Williams bases himself on a theologian called Farrer. As Williams writes, when we attempt to think of God, we are attempting to deploy and clarify a notion of agency, that is, unbrokenly using its entire resource, generating possibilities for every other conceivable agent. And Williams continues, as Farrer clearly said, this means that this infinite agency can never be prayed in aid to fill a gap in causal finite chains. What infinite agency causes simply is the system of secondary causality within which we finite agents act. Thus, in Williams's terms, what infinite agency, that is God, causes is the system of secondary causality, in other words, a system of cause and effect which science has revealed to us. In turn, this secondary causality provides a regular environment within which we humans, the finite agents as he calls us, act. Williams argues, amongst other things, that a regular environment is necessary to our free will. All a bit metaphysical, perhaps, but it seems clear enough to me that, on this account, Jesus did not physically ascend into the clouds at his ascension, for that would be, in Williams's terms, to break the chain of secondary causality. Rather, he sees God as an infinite agency responsible for how this world works. But to him, God is at least the world's designer. At least, that's how I would interpret Williams. But so then, does Williams reject the supernatural? Well, not a bit of it. Well, rather, he interprets and revises what we mean by the supernatural. In the conclusion to his book, he refers again back to Farrer. Farrer insisted that a supernatural act must be absolutely continuous with the natural activity. So a supernatural act is not something inserted into the natural world and breaking its integrity. Well now, this is all very well, one might think, but if the supernatural is not something inserted into the natural, well, what is it? The phrase Williams uses is as follows, that the infinite is to do with the degree to which the unconditioned is allowed to transform the finite from within. But then comes back the question, what is this unconditioned, and why does it transform from within? Perhaps an analogy with minds within bodies will help here. I don't think of my mind as being a different entity from my body. Rather, to me, it is the basis for interpreting the way that my body moves, that there are intentions and so human behavior which explain my movements. So, in an analogous way, God might be an additional aspect or dimension to the world, helping to explain what we experience. But I will give the last word to Williams himself. He starts from the concept of the word, that is, the concept as it occurs at the start of St. John's Gospel, logos in the Greek. He sees this word as infusing the world. As he puts it, the infinite word informs, subtends, and permeates the finite. I am reminded of the Gospel sentence, which in the New English Bible translation reads, "All that came to be was alive with the word's life." The word, the logos, thus provides an additional dimension or aspect to the world of living things. In summary, I have found three views of the supernatural. The traditionalist, Colin Buchan, believes that Jesus physically ascended into the sky. The revisionist, Rowan Williams, sees concepts of the supernatural as referring to an extra dimension or aspect to reality. And the rejectionist, Don Cupitt, claims that the supernatural does not exist. Which of these is correct? Or are there other variants? Well, as you have free will, I cannot dictate. Sorry to disappoint you. But there I must stop and hand on to Margaret for a further explanation of Cupitt's ethical position, the way we should live our life, which, as he sees it, is as God to us.
Right, okay. You might think that Cupitt was negative and rejectionist, but actually in the phrase, all this is all there is, the first all is really important. It's not just this is all there is, in a kind of negative Nietzsche sort of way, but all this. So he's celebrating the world, the life, as Hugh says, celebrating life, and thinking about how we can live it better. So if we go on to the final slide, I'm just going to very briefly say something about two more recent developments, which are about how we should live our lives, and he calls this solar living. And he explains solar living. It's somewhat obscure, but he says we should live as the sun does. It simply expends itself gloriously, and in so doing gives light to us all. The sun also epitomizes an integrated being of both dying and living. So his notion is that the sun is actually dying gradually, but in the process of dying, small parts of the sun are also dying because they're burning away, but it's recreating itself, so it's also living, and it's also throwing out a huge light and heat. So he feels we ought to live like the sun by throwing out, although we're on our journey towards death, we should be throwing out great warmth and light to our fellow humans. We should burn brightly in reckless and extravagant self-expression. So it's a very positive view of life, really. He espouses the ethics that are embedded in the Gospels, particularly those, and I'm certainly not going to go into it, but modern scholarship, particularly in America, in the Jesus movement, the Jesus seminar in particular, has been looking very carefully at what is thought to be the actual sayings that are closest to Jesus, and to distinguish those from some of the later additions in the Gospels and in the epistles. And certainly Cupitt espouses the ethics of Christianity. He also wants to move us into a post-ecclesiastical Christianity, rather than being Christianity which is framed by the church, one which is framed by the kingdom. So again, going back to the teaching of Jesus, as the kingdom being a key concept. So Cupitt talks about post-Christianity, which has the following ingredients. Christianity's capacity for self-transcendence. So in other words, the capacity for moving on and growing that Christianity has shown at certain periods, certainly in its development. That the kingdom as the expression of this greater reality, with its themes of immediacy, non-hierarchy and democracy. And there's a kind of way in which I think Cupitt is a bit in line with the kind of end of history view, that mankind has got to this stage of being involved in human rights, in democracy and liberal democracy, and that actually we're on our way, although many people are not within the church, we are on our way to a post-Christian ethical global world. That was, of course, all written in 2007, where things seemed a little bit happier than they do now. So perhaps he might be a bit less certain that we're on our way to this amazing post-Christianity. But it's still, I think he would believe that this is where we're going. And Jesus, as the one who proclaimed, the final ingredient of post-Christianity, is Jesus as the one who proclaimed a spirituality and a re-evaluating of values in the here and now, a teaching that's succinctly expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. So to end on a sort of positive note, I think, he says we should see religious thought and practice as imaginative and utopian. Religion is a communal way of reimagining and remaking the self and the world. It's what we are to live by and what we are to live for. We need religion as much as ever. We need it as a human value-creating activity. Right, we're now going to have a short break while we reorganise, and then we're going to connect with Zoom. So if you're listening at home, if you would like to try opening that up, we will be a few minutes while we get organised here, and then we hope to connect with you again. And please think of any points for discussion or arguments you want to make, or any questions you would like to ask during that period while we reorganise. Thank you.